One of the most potent powers of the judicial branch is the power to rule on the constitutionality of laws. You see, when the Congress passes a bill and the President signs it into law, that law is not necessarily absolute. What determines its absoluteness is its constitutionality. The role of making that determination falls to the courts. But did you know that nowhere in the Constitution does it specifically say that the court has this power of determining constitutionality? So if it's not in the Constitution, where does such an extraordinary power come from? To find out, we have to go back to the year 1800. It was an election year, and President John Adams had just lost his re-election bid to his arch-rival, Thomas Jefferson. Frustrated with his defeat, Adams decided in the waning hours of his presidency to fill as many government positions as possible with members of his party, which was the Federalist Party. These are often referred to as the midnight appointments, and were intended to reduce Jefferson's opportunity to fill the positions once he was sworn in as president. Well, one of the appointments was of a man named William Marbury, who was to be appointed a federal justice of the peace in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately for Marbury, Jefferson took over the reins before the appointment was officially given to him. Jefferson, a member of the Democratic-Republican Party, a party he created, instructed his Secretary of State, James Madison, to stop delivery of the appointment, which had been in transit. In response, Marbury sued Madison to try to force him to deliver the appointment. And in his lawsuit, Marbury asked the Supreme Court of the United States to issue something called a writ of mandamus, which is essentially an order of the court demanding Madison follow through with the appointment. The authority of the court to issue writs of mandamus is not a power prescribed in the Constitution, but it had been created in the Judiciary Act passed by the very first Congress in 1789. Because Marbury filed his case with the Supreme Court directly, the court had to decide if it could take up the case, because the Constitution limits which cases the court can hear directly without going through lower courts first. Here's where things get interesting. The court decided that even though the Judiciary Act of 1789 had prescribed this power of the Supreme Court to issue writs of mandamus, thus implying it should be able to take up Marbury's case, that provision of the law was not constitutional. In other words, according to the court, the law Marbury was relying upon was illegal, so they could not take up his case. As a result, poor Marbury lost and never became a justice of the peace. This might sound like a relatively simple case, but nothing could be further from the truth. You see, the idea of the court declaring a law unconstitutional may be familiar by today's standards, but at the time, it had never happened before. It was a brand new concept, one that may have been talked about in theory, but never actually carried out. Yet in this case, which is called Marbury versus Madison, and is bar none the most significant case in our nation's history, Chief Justice Marshall, who himself was a Federalist opposed to Thomas Jefferson's party, declared, quote, "It is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is." Now, those are no small words. In fact, while one might think Jefferson would be happy with the fact that he ultimately prevailed in stopping Marbury's appointment, he most certainly was not. He was livid. He understood the precedent that the court was setting here and feared that allowing the Constitution to mean whatever the court says it means would make the Constitution, to use his words, a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. Jefferson strongly disagreed with Marshall's reasoning, saying that if this view of judicial power became accepted, it would be placing us under the despotism of an oligarchy, to use his words again. There are a number of ironies in the Marbury case, not the least of which is the fact that Jefferson won, but lost. Probably the biggest irony of all was this. In order to rule that the power of writs of mandamus contained in the Judiciary Act of 1789 was an unconstitutional granting of new power to the court itself had to assume a new power, the power of judicial review, to make that determination in the first place. In other words, the Supreme Court had to assume a new power in order to say Congress could not give it a new power. The court's own assumed power of judicial review was constitutional in their eyes, but the power of writs of mandamus given to them by the Congress was not. Suffice it to say, this power of judicial review, which reserves to the Supreme Court final authority to judge whether or not actions of the President or of the Congress are within the powers granted to them by the Constitution, would change the dynamics within the balance of power between the three branches of government. It has proved an enormous tool for the judiciary to exercise as part of checks and balances, the ramifications of which we continue to see to this day.